President Trump acknowledging Americans could feel some pain in the short term from escalating trade tensions with Canada, Mexico, and China. He also threatened to impose tariffs elsewhere, claiming that the U.S. has been treated, quote, terribly by the likes of the EU and others. With us now, we want to bring in Paul Krugman. He is a Nobel laureate in economics and the author of the Substack, Paul Krugman. Paul, it's great to have you back on the program. We were just talking to Secretary Ross just a moment ago. I have a feeling you're going to have a bit of a different perspective when it comes to tariffs. Let's talk about how you see this playing out, the risk maybe that this potentially poses to the U.S. economy. I know in the past you've called them really destructive. I think the question is, to what extent, what is the extent of that harm that we could see if we continue on this path?
Okay. The first thing to understand is that, they could put a gloss on it. There's a lot of pretense, but yesterday, Trump folded. We got essentially nothing substantive from Canada or Mexico. They basically promised to continue doing things they were already doing, and there was really nothing there. So at least for the moment, it appears that Trump and his administration lost their nerve, and we didn't, which is good from my point of view because this was really destructive. The key thing about the Canada and Mexico potential trade war is that the North American economy, three countries, is very integrated. I mean, there is really no such thing as U.S. manufacturing or Canadian manufacturing. There's just North American manufacturing. When we make a car, you ask, where was it made? Well, the answer is everywhere. It was, or rather, all across North America. The parts come from different places. The components of the car may cross the border 7 or 8 times before you end up with a final vehicle. And if you put 25% tariffs on everything, that really just totally disrupts that industry. I mean, that's and manufacturing in general. So this would have been extremely costly. It would have made U.S. industry much less competitive against the rest of the world, and would have been, it would have hurt everybody. But what was also, I think, rather remarkable is that we tend to forget that other countries are real. They have their own nationalism. They have their own pride. To use the technical term, Canada and Mexico were extremely pissed at this threat and were prepared to pay the price of imposing retaliatory tariffs. I noticed that Secretary Ross talked about the Canadians who were talking about a phased introduction of retaliatory tariffs. The Mexicans were not. They were saying right away, we will retaliate one for one. And the Canadians were edging towards that position as well. So everybody concerned, I mean, I'm glad to see that somehow or other, the U.S. stepped back from the brink and didn't do this. And we'll see whether, what will change in a month. But I think we just dodged a bullet here.
What does that then look like moving forward, especially because right after the election, we saw this huge stock market rally, in part due to this thesis from investors that Trump was going to watch the market as a check on his policies. How true does that become if the market resolves any tariff questions the second a negotiation is mentioned?
Well, it does mean that certainly Trump watches the market. Maybe the only thing that he pays attention to. He certainly isn't listening to economists. And if the market, I mean, actually, I thought the market reaction to the impending tariffs was pretty mild, considering. But maybe the market correctly judged that he was likely to back down. And so at this point, anyway, the market seems to have stopped him from going in that direction. I will say that what strikes me is I see a lot of my fellow economists saying that these tariffs are the biggest threat on policy. They are a big threat, but mass deportations is even bigger. So we have to see what goes on there. But if if you would cripple manufacturing if we have a trade war with Mexico and Canada, you will cripple agriculture and construction if we actually have mass deportations. So that's the other thing to keep an eye on.
Real quick, Paul, before we move on to this, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about the mass deportation threat, but going back to what you just said about the muted market's reaction, then does that almost give President Trump permission to get more aggressive on the trade war front going forward?
Oh, I don't think so. I think that even though the reaction was fairly small on Monday, it was apparently enough. Something. I mean, he folded. Let's not pretend that there was, they will try to spin this, but basically he folded. Basically, he breathed fire and brimstone and then did nothing. And it's hard to see what could have made that happen, except that the market started to go down. And so that I think is probably going to, whatever is the opposite of emboldening, is probably going to mean that he's going to be very cautious. I mean, we're already joking that tariff month may become the Trump 2 equivalent of infrastructure week. Remember how every week we were going to have a serious infrastructure plan, which never came? And maybe the big tariffs are going to be like that. Every month we're going to have, okay, this month we're really going to get serious about tariffs, and it won't happen, which, by the way, from the point of view of the economy, is a good thing, because this stuff was all crazy to begin with.
Since you mentioned it, I do want to talk to you about the labor market, and we're going to talk about this throughout our show, but the job opening labor turnover survey coming out this morning indicating that there are more job openings available, but the quit rate did remain steady. How should folks who are looking for jobs that might be listening to this conversation be thinking about the economic impact of the Trump administration's policies on the labor market? Is there a real sickness starting to happen in hiring in the labor market, or is it just wait and see as companies wait to get clarity on policies?
I think it's very monthly data. JOLTS data are very noisy, and you don't want to read too much into any given month. And there really hasn't been time for Trump policies, especially since not much has happened yet, right? Mostly it's just threats and policies to have much of an impact. But there's no, aside from the tariff and deportation threats, there's no, and what is AI a bubble and all of that, but there's no sort of imminent reason to think that we're going to see any major deterioration in the job market. It someday will happen, but there's nothing right there in the data to tell you that it's happening already. And so far, it's a funny job market. It's one with very full employment, but kind of low turnover. It's a little bit harder to find jobs than you would expect given the unemployment rate, but it's nothing drastic.
So, Paul, just taking a step further, what do you see as the specific risks or specific effects of some of the proposed policies, including mass deportations?
Well, I think, first of all, we're talking about inflation here, and people have been modeling now 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, but it doesn't stop there, because if you do that, then U.S. industry becomes a lot less competitive against Japan and Europe. And so they would sort of almost have to extend the tariffs to the rest of the advanced world. And so it's quite easy to come up with raising consumer prices by 1% or more, just sort of right from the get-go. If we actually go through with this, if it turns out this was just a 30-day pause and then it really happens. And then again, the thing that strikes me about the deportations is that, if it was just that we had 5 or 6 million undocumented workers spread evenly across the economy, that would be one thing. But they're not. They're very, very concentrated in a handful of pretty key sectors, and sectors that are really important to consumer prices. Again, the agricultural workforce is mainly immigrants, about half of them probably undocumented, but we've already seen that if we have a serious roundup, a lot of people who are legally here will get caught up anyway, or at least will be terrified and will be withdrawing from their jobs. So we're talking about food prices, definitely. Between tariffs and deportations, where do you think we get our groceries from? We get them from immigrant labor in the farms of California and from Mexico. And construction. One of the areas where we really have seen inflation outpace wages has been housing. And construction workers, especially the people who actually physically do construction, as opposed to people who are employed in construction industry offices, are, again, very, very heavily immigrant. So we're talking about a lot of inflationary pressure if Trump actually follows through with what he said he's going to do.
And a lot of pressure in very important sectors for American households and budgets. Paul, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.